I'm Marcus Dalton, 42 years old, and everything changed when the police chief's son called me the N-word during what should have been a routine traffic stop on the most important day of my daughter's life. What started as me rushing to make it to Zara's high school graduation ceremony ended with me sitting in my car on the side of Highway 34, shaking with a rage I hadn't felt since my father was beaten by cops in Alabama when I was 12 years old. The officer who pulled me over had no idea who I was, and I made sure to keep it that way, even as every instinct in my body screamed to fight back. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that subscribe button and join me as I share how one moment of pure hatred set in motion events that would expose corruption reaching the highest levels of our police department. The morning of June 15th started like any other Saturday, except it wasn't. Zara had been talking about graduation for months, planning every detail of the day from the dress she'd wear under her cap and gown to the restaurant where we'd celebrate afterward. My wife Simone had taken the day off from the hospital where she worked as a pediatric nurse, and we'd both cleared our schedules completely. Zara was our only child, born after years of trying and multiple miscarriages that had nearly broken Simone's spirit. This graduation wasn't just marking the end of high school, it was celebrating everything we'd worked toward as a family for 18 years. I left the house at 1:30 p.m., giving myself plenty of time to pick up the flowers Zara had specifically requested, white roses with baby's breath, the same combination Simone had carried at our wedding. The graduation ceremony was scheduled to start at 3 p.m., and I'd promised to be there by 2:15. To help her with last-minute preparations and take pictures before the procession. Traffic was lighter than usual on Highway 34, and I was making good time when I noticed the patrol car I wasn't speeding. I know this because I'd been checking my speedometer obsessively, paranoid about being late. I was doing 68 in a 70-mile-per-hour zone, staying in the right lane, using my turn signals for every lane change. When the red and blue lights started flashing behind me, my first thought was that the officer was trying to get around me to respond to an emergency call somewhere ahead. I moved to the shoulder and slowed down, expecting him to pass. Instead, he pulled in behind me. Officer B. Henley, according to his name tag, was maybe 26 years old with the kind of aggressive swagger that immediately put me on edge. He had sandy brown hair, pale skin that looked like it had never seen real physical work, and eyes that seemed to be looking for a reason to escalate whatever this was about to become. When he approached my driver's side window, I had my license, registration, and insurance card ready, my hands visible on the steering wheel exactly the way my father had taught me 30 years ago. "License and registration," he said without preamble. No explanation for why he'd stopped me. His voice had that particular tone I'd heard countless times before, the sound of someone who'd never been told no and never expected to be questioned. I handed over my documents, noting how he barely glanced at them before asking me to step out of the vehicle. "Is there a problem, officer?" I asked, keeping my voice calm and respectful despite the growing knot in my stomach. I knew I hadn't done anything wrong, but experience had taught me that being right didn't always matter when you looked like me and the person with the badge looked like him. "I'll ask the questions," he snapped back. "Step out of the car. Now." As I complied, moving slowly and deliberately to avoid any sudden motions that could be misinterpreted, Officer Henley positioned himself slightly behind me and to my right. The afternoon sun was beating down on the asphalt, and I could feel sweat starting to form on my forehead, though whether from the heat or the situation, I couldn't tell. "Where are you coming from?" he asked. "Home," I replied. "I'm on my way to my daughter's graduation ceremony." "What's in the car?" "Nothing unusual. Some flowers for my daughter, my wallet, my phone." It was then that Officer Henley's demeanor shifted from merely aggressive to something darker. He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the coffee on his breath and see the small scar above his left eyebrow. When he spoke again, his voice dropped to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than if he'd been shouting. "You know what I think?" he said, circling around to face me directly. "I think you're lying to me. I think you've got something in that car you don't want me to find. Drugs, maybe. Weapons. Something that explains why you were driving so nervous, checking your mirrors every 5 seconds." I wanted to tell him I'd been checking my mirrors because I was worried about being late, not because I was carrying anything illegal. I wanted to explain that my daughter was probably getting dressed right now, that Simone was saving me a seat in the front row, that this was supposed to be one of the best days of our family's life. Instead, I kept my mouth shut and my hands where he could see them. The search of my vehicle took 45 minutes. Officer Henley went through every compartment, every pocket, under every seat with the methodical thoroughness of someone who was absolutely convinced he would find something incriminating. He emptied my glove compartment onto the ground, scattered Zara's carefully arranged flowers across the dashboard, and even opened the individual petals of some roses, as if I might have hidden drugs inside them. When he found nothing but registration papers, insurance documents, and the small emergency kit Simone had insisted I keep in the trunk, his frustration became palpable. I stood on the shoulder of Highway 34, watching cars pass by filled with families probably heading to their own important events, their own celebrations, while this man systematically destroyed any chance I had of making it to my daughter's graduation on time. By 2:45 p.m., I knew it was too late. Even if he released me immediately, even if I broke every speed limit between here and the school, I would miss the processional, miss seeing Zara walk across that stage to receive her diploma. "Clean car," Officer Henley said finally, his tone suggesting this somehow made me more suspicious rather than less. "Real clean, almost like you knew someone might be looking through it." He was standing close to me again, close enough that I could see the small beads of perspiration on his upper lip, despite the fact that I was the one who'd been standing in the direct sunlight for the better part of an hour. "Officer, I really need to get to my daughter's graduation," I said, checking my phone. 7 missed calls from Simone, 12 text messages I couldn't read without potentially provoking him further. "The ceremony started 15 minutes ago. Could you please tell me what this is about?" That's when Officer Henley smiled, and I knew with absolute certainty that whatever was about to happen next would be worse than everything that had come before. It was the kind of smile I'd seen on the faces of men who enjoyed having power over others, who fed off the helplessness they could create with a badge and a gun. "What this is about," he said, moving even closer, "is respect. See? I don't like your attitude. I don't like the way you've been looking at me, like you think you're better than me, like you think you don't belong here getting pulled over like any other." He paused, letting the silence stretch out between us before finishing his sentence. "Like any other person who might be up to no good." I felt something cold settle in my chest. This wasn't about traffic violations or suspected contraband. This was about something much older and much more dangerous. I thought about my father's stories from Alabama, about the careful dance he'd taught me to perform in situations exactly like this one. "Keep your hands visible. Don't make sudden movements." "Yes, sir." "No, sir. Survive first. Seek justice later." "I understand, officer," I said quietly. "I apologize if I seem disrespectful. That wasn't my intention." "Your intention," Officer Henley repeated, as if the word itself offended him. "You know what I think your intention was? I think you were planning to drive to wherever you were really going. Probably some drug deal, some meeting with your criminal friends, and you figured you'd play the concerned father card if anyone stopped you. Graduate daughter, family man, all of that bullshit." My phone was buzzing constantly now. Simone trying to reach me, probably wondering where I was, whether something had happened. I imagined Zara in her cap and gown, looking for me in the audience, wondering why her father wasn't there to see her walk across the stage. 18 years of bedtime stories, homework help, driving lessons, college applications, all leading up to this moment that I was missing because a man with a badge had decided I looked suspicious. "The thing is," Officer Henley continued, his voice dropping to that threatening whisper again, "I've been watching you this whole time, and you know what I see? I see someone who thinks he's smart, someone who thinks he can outsmart me, outweight me, maybe even complain about me later." He laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor. "But here's what you don't understand about how this works." He stepped back, just far enough to look me up and down with obvious contempt, his eyes lingering on my pressed khakis, my button-down shirt, the small gold cross Simone had given me for our anniversary that hung on a chain around my neck. "You can dress it up however you want," he said. "You can put on the nice clothes, drive the clean car, talk about your daughter's graduation, but I know what you really are. We both know what you really are." The word came out of his mouth like a physical blow, sharp and deliberate and designed to cut as deeply as possible. "You're just another no who got pulled over and tried to play innocent." The world seemed to stop moving. Cars continued passing on the highway. The sun continued beating down on the asphalt. My phone continued buzzing in my pocket, but everything else went completely silent. I stared at Officer Henley, this young man who couldn't have been much older than some of my daughter's classmates, and felt something break inside my chest that I wasn't sure could ever be repaired. "And if you're thinking about filing some complaint," he continued, apparently interpreting my silence as submission rather than shock, "if you're thinking about calling my supervisor or running to the media with some sob story about missing your little girl's graduation, let me save you the trouble." His smile widened, showing teeth that probably cost more than most people made in a month. "My daddy's Chief Robert Henley. He runs this whole department, and he's been dealing with people like you a lot longer than I have. So go ahead and complain. See how far it gets you." Officer Henley handed me back my license and registration with exaggerated courtesy, like he was doing me some kind of favor. "You're free to go," he said. "Drive safe now. Wouldn't want anything to happen to you on your way to that graduation you're so worried about. I got back in my car with hands that were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. In my rearview mirror, I watched Officer Henley return to his patrol car, probably to fill out some report that would make this whole encounter seem routine and justified. My phone showed 3:47 p.m. The graduation ceremony would be over in another hour, and I had missed all of it. I sat there for a long time before starting the engine, trying to process what had just happened, trying to figure out how to explain to my wife and daughter why I wasn't there for one of the most important moments in our family's life. In my pocket, my phone continued buzzing with messages I wasn't ready to read, questions I wasn't sure how to answer. What Officer Henley didn't know, what he couldn't have known as he drove away feeling satisfied with his afternoon's work, was that every word of our encounter had been recorded on the small body camera I wore as part of my job, the same job that had taught me to document everything, to gather evidence, to build cases that could withstand scrutiny in court. The job I'd been doing for the past 18 months as an Internal Affairs Investigator for the very department his father commanded. The drive home from Highway 34 was the longest 23 minutes of my life. I sat in my driveway for another 10 minutes, staring at our house through the windshield, trying to figure out how to walk through that front door and face my family. The graduation ceremony had ended 30 minutes ago. Simone and Zara would be home soon, probably wondering if I'd been in an accident, probably calling hospitals by now since I hadn't answered any of their calls. I finally forced myself to get out of the car, the white roses still scattered across my dashboard where Officer Henley had thrown them during his search. Most of the petals had fallen off, leaving bare stems and broken promises. I gathered what I could salvage and walked up the front steps of the house we'd bought, specifically because it was in Zara's school district, because we'd wanted her to have every advantage we could provide. Simone's car pulled into the driveway just as I reached the front door. I turned to watch my wife and daughter get out, still wearing their graduation day clothes. Simone in the navy blue dress she'd bought specifically for this occasion. Zara in the sundress she'd planned to wear under her cap and gown. The look on both their faces when they saw me standing there told me everything I needed to know about how the ceremony had gone without me. "Marcus," Simone said, her voice carefully controlled in the way it got when she was trying not to lose her temper in front of Zara. "Where were you? We called you 20 times. The ceremony started at 3, and you promised you'd be there by 2:15. Zara didn't say anything. She just looked at me with the kind of disappointment that only an 18-year-old can project, the kind that makes you feel like you've failed at the most basic requirements of being a parent. Her graduation cap was still pinned to her hair, slightly crooked now, and there were tear tracks on her cheeks that she'd tried to cover with makeup. "I got pulled over," I said, the words feeling inadequate before they even left my mouth. "There was a situation with a traffic stop, and it took longer than expected. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I missed it." "Pulled over for what?" Simone asked, moving closer, her nurse's instincts kicking in as she noticed something in my expression. "Marcus, what happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." I looked at my daughter, standing there in her graduation dress with her cap still on, and realized I couldn't tell them the truth. Not yet. Not when Zara was already dealing with the disappointment of me not being there. Not when explaining what Officer Henley had said and done would only add racial trauma to what should have been one of the happiest days of her life. "Speeding ticket," I lied, hating myself for it. The officer was thorough, checked everything. By the time he was done, it was too late to make it to the ceremony. Zara finally spoke, her voice small and hurt. "You missed my speech, Dad. I was valedictorian and you missed my speech. I kept looking for you in the audience, thinking maybe you were just running late, but you never came." The weight of that hit me harder than anything Officer Henley had said or done. Valedictorian. My daughter had been valedictorian, and I'd missed her speech because a racist cop with a badge and a famous last name had decided to show me my place in his world. That night, after we'd gone through the motions of a celebration dinner at Zara's favorite restaurant, after we'd taken pictures that couldn't quite hide the absence I'd created, after my daughter had gone to bed still wearing her graduation cap because she said it made her feel better, I sat in my home office staring at the body camera footage I'd recorded. The video was crystal clear. Every word Officer Henley had spoken, every moment of the 45-minute encounter, every instance of harassment and racial intimidation, all captured in high-definition digital format. I watched myself standing on that highway shoulder, watched the careful way I'd kept my hands visible, heard my own voice staying respectful and calm, even as this man systematically destroyed one of the most important days of... I'd been working internal affairs for 18 months, long enough to know exactly how these complaints typically went. Officer receives allegation. Officer denies allegation. No witnesses means no corroboration. Case closed, sometimes with a note in the file that amounts to nothing more than departmental paperwork. But this was different. This time there was video evidence that couldn't be denied or explained away. The next Monday morning, I sat in my supervisor's office. Detective Captain Nina Vasquez, a 20-year veteran who'd transferred to IA after spending most of her career in narcotics. Nina had a reputation for being thorough and fair, someone who'd fought her own battles against discrimination in a department that hadn't always welcomed women or minorities in positions of authority. "This is bad, Marcus," she said after watching the footage. "This is really bad. But you know who we're dealing with here, right? Chief Henley's son, the chief who's been running this department for 12 years, who has connections at the state level, who's probably going to retire in the next few years and wants to make sure his legacy stays intact. I knew all of that. I'd known it the moment Officer Henley mentioned his father's name on that highway shoulder, but I'd also known that if I didn't pursue this complaint, if I let this incident disappear into the same black hole that had swallowed so many other allegations over the years, then nothing would ever change. "We follow the evidence," I said, echoing the phrase Nina used at the beginning of every investigation. "We build the case properly, we document everything, and we let the facts speak for themselves." "The facts," Nina repeated, leaning back in her chair. "The facts are that Officer Bryce Henley has been on the force for 3 years with a clean record. The facts are that you're the only person making this allegation. The facts are that his father is going to circle the wagons the minute we serve papers for this investigation." Over the next 2 weeks, Nina and I began building the case. We requested Officer Henley's personnel file, his training records, any previous complaints or disciplinary actions. We asked for his duty roster, trying to establish patterns in his patrol areas and traffic stops. We requested the department's body camera footage from the day of my stop, knowing it would likely show equipment malfunction or convenient technical difficulties. Every request was met with delays. Officer Henley's personnel file was being updated and wouldn't be available for another week. His training records were stored in a different system that required special access. The body camera footage from his vehicle was corrupted due to a software glitch that had affected multiple units that day. "Funny how these technical problems always seem to happen when we need evidence," Nina said after receiving the third email explaining why requested documents weren't available. "It's almost like someone's trying to slow down our investigation." During those same 2 weeks, I noticed changes in how my colleagues treated me. Conversations that stopped when I entered the break room. Assignments that seemed to keep me away from the main IA office during important meetings. Small things that individually could be explained as coincidence but collectively painted a picture of professional isolation. The turning point came when Detective Sarah Chen, someone I'd worked closely with on several cases, pulled me aside after a staff meeting. "Marcus, I need to tell you something," she said, looking around to make sure we couldn't be overheard. "Word's gotten around about your complaint against the Henley kid. People are talking. Some of them are saying you're making trouble for political reasons, trying to make a name for yourself by going after the chief's son." "And what do you think?" I asked. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "I think you wouldn't file a complaint unless something really bad happened. But I also think you need to be careful. Chief Henley has a long memory, and he's got friends in places that matter." That evening, I sat in my car outside Zara's high school, watching students leave after various summer activities. Some of them waved at me, recognizing me from years of picking up my daughter, from volunteer work at school events, from being a visible part of this community we'd chosen to make our home. What Officer Henley had taken from me wasn't just the graduation ceremony, it was the sense of safety I'd felt in this place. The belief that if I followed the rules and kept my head down and worked hard, I could protect my family from the kind of hatred that had shaped my father's generation. Sitting there in my car, I realized that safety had always been an illusion, and now I had to decide whether to accept that illusion or fight to change the reality underneath it. The breakthrough came 3 weeks into the investigation, but not in the way I'd expected. Nina had managed to track down 2 other complaints against Officer Bryce Henley that had been filed in the past 18 months, both involving traffic stops, both involving black drivers, and both mysteriously resolved without disciplinary action. The complainants had been contacted by phone and told their allegations couldn't be substantiated due to lack of evidence. I was reviewing these case files in my office when Detective Chen knocked on my door, her expression more serious than I'd seen it since we'd started working together 2 years ago. She closed the door behind her and sat down across from my desk without being invited, which immediately told me something significant was about to happen. "Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me," she said. "How long have you been planning this?" I looked up from the files, confused. "Planning what?" "This investigation, this complaint against Bryce Henley. How long have you been working on it?" The question caught me off guard. "Sarah, I filed the complaint 3 weeks ago after he pulled me over and used racial slurs. You know this. You've been helping with the investigation?" "That's what I thought," she said, but her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "But then I was going through some old case files looking for patterns in complaints against the Henley family, and I found something interesting. She pulled out a folder I didn't recognize. This is from 8 months ago, a complaint filed by Mrs. Cordelia Banks, 73 years old, about Officer Henley making inappropriate comments during a traffic stop. The complaint was dismissed, but look at who signed off on the initial interview. She slid a document across my desk. At the bottom, in my own handwriting, was my signature on an Internal Affairs intake form dated October 15th of the previous year. I stared at it, feeling something cold settle in my stomach as the memory came flooding back. Mrs. Banks had been a soft-spoken elderly woman who'd come to the IA office claiming that Officer Henley had been disrespectful and inappropriate during a traffic stop, making comments about how people like her shouldn't be driving expensive cars. I'd conducted the initial interview, documented her statement, and submitted it for investigation. 2 weeks later, I'd been told the case was closed due to insufficient evidence. "I remember her," I said slowly. "But Sarah, that was just one case. I wasn't building anything back then. I was just doing my job." "Were you?" she asked, pulling out another file. "Because I found 2 more cases you handled involving the same officer. Different complainants, same pattern of behavior, same outcome, all dismissed, all signed off on by you." I stared at the files she'd placed in front of me. 3 separate complaints against Bryce Henley spanning nearly a year, all of which had crossed my desk, all of which I documented and investigated according to standard procedure. At the time, each had seemed like an isolated incident. I'd followed protocol, gathered what evidence I could, and accepted the department's determination that there wasn't enough proof to proceed. "You think I've been targeting him," I said, understanding finally dawning. "You think I've been building a case against Bryce Henley for months, and my own traffic stop was just an excuse to bring it all together." "I think," Sarah said carefully, "that maybe you've been more aware of Officer Henley's behavior than you initially let on. And I think maybe your own experience with him wasn't as random as it seemed." She was right, but not in the way she thought. The truth was more complicated than a simple conspiracy, and it had taken her questions to help me see the full picture myself. I'd been tracking patterns of complaints and behavior across the entire department for over a year, not targeting any specific officer, but looking for systemic issues that might indicate larger problems. Bryce Henley's name had appeared in my analysis multiple times, not just as the subject of complaints, but as part of a broader pattern of officers whose behavior suggested they felt protected from consequences. The traffic stop incident hadn't been planned, but my response to it had been informed by months of research and investigation that I'd been conducting as part of my larger IA responsibilities. "Sarah," I said, making a decision that would change everything, "I need to show you something. But first, I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you goes way beyond one traffic stop and one racist cop." I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a thick file folder that I'd been compiling since my first month in Internal Affairs. Inside were photocopies of complaints, disciplinary records, training reports, and personnel files for nearly 24 officers across the department. What I'd discovered was a pattern of behavior that suggested certain officers, particularly those with family connections or political influence, were operating under different rules than everyone else. "This isn't about Bryce Henley specifically," I explained, spreading the document across my desk. "This is about a culture of impunity that starts at the top and filters down through the ranks. Officers who know they're protected, who know their connections will shield them from consequences, who feel free to abuse their authority because they've never faced real accountability." Sarah leaned forward, studying the documents. "Marcus, how long have you been working on this?" "Since I transferred to IA 18 months ago. It started as just doing my job, investigating individual complaints, but I began to see patterns. The same names appearing as witnesses for each other, the same supervisors signing off on dismissals, the same types of victims whose complaints never seemed to stick. I pulled out a timeline I'd been constructing, showing how complaints against certain officers were handled differently than complaints against others. Officers with family connections, political relationships, or social influence within the department received what amounted to preferential treatment during investigations. "The traffic stop 3 weeks ago wasn't planned," I continued. "But when it happened, when Bryce Henley said what he said and did what he did, I realized I had something I'd never had before. Direct evidence, captured on video, of the kind of behavior that usually happens in the shadows." Sarah was quiet for a long time, reading through the files, cross-referencing names and dates. Finally, she looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You're telling me you've been conducting an unauthorized investigation into corruption in our own department for over a year?" "I'm telling you, I've been doing my job as an Internal Affairs Investigator, which is to look for patterns of misconduct and abuse of authority. What I found was bigger than individual cases. And the body camera footage from your traffic stop is..." real evidence of real misconduct that happened to me personally. The fact that it fits into a larger pattern doesn't make it less valid. Sarah stood up, gathering the files. Marcus, if what you're showing me is accurate, if this pattern holds up under scrutiny, then we're not just talking about disciplining one officer. We're talking about exposing systemic corruption that could implicate dozens of people, including supervisors and administrators. I know, including potentially the chief himself. I know that too. She paused at the door, her hand on the handle. Are you sure you want to do this? Are you sure you want to be the person who brings down this whole system? I thought about Zara's graduation, about the look of disappointment on her face when I'd failed to be there for one of the most important moments of her life. I thought about Mrs. Banks, sitting in this same office 8 months ago, trying to explain how a traffic stop had made her feel humiliated and powerless. I thought about all the other victims whose complaints had been dismissed, whose voices had been silenced, whose experiences had been invalidated by a system designed to protect its own. I'm sure, but I'm going to need help. This is bigger than what Nina and I can handle alone. Sarah nodded slowly. Then we're going to need to bring in people from outside the department, people who can't be influenced or intimidated by Chief Henley or anyone else. Federal authorities, FBI Civil Rights Division, maybe the State Attorney General's office, people with jurisdiction and resources who can investigate without internal interference. As Sarah left my office, I realized that what had started as a simple complaint about a traffic stop had become something much larger. I wasn't just seeking justice for what Bryce Henley had done to me. I was opening the door to an investigation that could fundamentally change how our entire department operated. The scared, humiliated man who'd sat on the side of Highway 34 3 weeks ago was gone. In his place was someone who understood that individual justice and systemic change were sometimes the same thing, and that the body camera footage in my desk drawer was just the beginning of a much bigger story. The meeting with FBI Special Agent Rachel Morrison took place on a Tuesday morning in a conference room at the Federal Building downtown, 37 days after Officer Bryce Henley had called me a racial slur on Highway 34. Agent Morrison was a woman in her early 40s with graying hair and the kind of methodical demeanor that suggested she'd built her career on cases that required patience and precision. She'd been investigating civil rights violations in law enforcement for over a decade, and when Sarah had reached out through proper federal channels, Agent Morrison had responded within 24 hours. "Mr. Dalton," she said, reviewing the files we'd compiled over the past month, "what you've documented here suggests a pattern of constitutional violations that goes well beyond individual misconduct. If these allegations can be substantiated..." We're looking at potential federal charges under Section 242 of Title 18, deprivation of rights under color of law. Sitting beside me, Nina shifted uncomfortably. Bringing in federal authorities meant acknowledging that our own department couldn't police itself, something that went against every instinct she'd developed during 20 years of trying to work within the system. But the evidence we'd gathered over the past month had made it clear that internal investigation alone wouldn't be sufficient. "Agent Morrison," I said, "I need you to understand that this isn't just about what happened to me. The traffic stop was personal, but what we've uncovered suggests that Officer Henley's behavior is part of a larger culture of impunity that's been protected by departmental leadership." I slid across the table a document we'd prepared summarizing our findings. In the 37 days since my encounter with Bryce Henley, we'd identified 8 additional complaints against him that had been dismissed without proper investigation. We'd found evidence that witnesses had been discouraged from cooperating with Internal Affairs. We'd discovered that Officer Henley's personnel file had been systematically sanitized, with negative evaluations and disciplinary recommendations mysteriously disappearing from his record. More concerning, Nina added, is what we found when we started looking at how complaints against other officers with family connections were handled. There's a clear pattern of preferential treatment that suggests supervisory involvement in obstruction of justice. Agent Morrison spent the next 2 hours reviewing our evidence, asking detailed questions about how we'd obtained documents, how we'd verified witness statement, how we'd established timelines and patterns of behavior. Her questions were thorough and sometimes skeptical, which I appreciated. If our case was going to survive federal scrutiny, it needed to be bulletproof. "The body camera footage from your traffic stop is compelling," she said finally. "But by itself, it only establishes misconduct by one officer. To build a broader civil rights case, we'll need cooperation from victims who've been afraid to come forward, documentation that shows supervisory knowledge and approval of these patterns, and evidence that the department has systematically failed to address known problems." "We think we can provide all of that," Sarah said, speaking for the first time since the meeting had begun. "But we'll need federal protection for witnesses and immunity guarantees for department personnel who cooperate with the investigation." Agent Morrison nodded. We can arrange both. But Mr. Dalton, I need to be clear about what you're signing up for. Once we open a federal investigation, there's no going back. Your department will be under a microscope. Your colleagues will know you initiated this process. Your family will be scrutinized. Are you prepared for that level of exposure? I thought about Zara, now in her first semester of college, finally able to talk about her graduation day without the shadow of disappointment that had hung over that memory for months. I thought about Simone, who'd supported my decision to pursue the complaint even when it meant reliving the trauma of that traffic stop over and over again. I thought about the community we'd built in this city, the relationships we'd formed, the life we'd created that could all be affected by what I was about to set in motion. I'm prepared, I said, but I want to know that this investigation will be thorough and that there will be real consequences for people who've abused their authority. If the evidence supports federal charges, there will be consequences, Agent Morrison assured me. Civil rights violations carry serious penalties, including significant prison time for convicted officers and potential federal oversight of departments that show patterns of constitutional violations. The federal investigation began quietly 2 weeks later. Agent Morrison's team started by interviewing witnesses who'd filed complaints against Bryce Henley and other officers in our database. They subpoenaed personnel files, training records, and internal communications that our IA office hadn't been able to access. They brought in forensic accountants to examine whether federal grant money had been misused to cover up misconduct or silence victims. Within a month, the scope of the investigation had expanded beyond anything I'd originally imagined. Federal agents were interviewing current and former department employees, examining use of force incidents, reviewing arrest records for patterns of racial bias, and analyzing body camera footage from hundreds of traffic stops and interactions with civilians. The breakthrough came when Agent Morrison's team found email communications between Chief Henley and several supervisors discussing how to handle problematic complaints and difficult witnesses. The emails, recovered from the department's server backup systems, showed explicit instructions to discourage certain investigations and to prioritize department reputation over individual grievances. "This is it," Agent Morrison told me during a briefing 6 weeks into the federal investigation. "This is the evidence we need to show that the civil rights violations weren't just individual misconduct, but part of a deliberate policy of suppression and retaliation." 3 days later, federal agents executed search warrants simultaneously at the police department, Chief Henley's office, and the homes of 5 supervisors, including Deputy Chief Michael Torres and Internal Affairs Captain David Webb. The raids were coordinated to prevent destruction of evidence and conducted with the kind of precision that made it clear this wasn't a fishing expedition, but the culmination of a methodical investigation. I was in my office when the federal agents arrived at the department building. Through my window, I could see news crews setting up across the street, alerted by the unusual activity. My phone was buzzing constantly with calls from colleagues, reporters, and community members trying to understand what was happening. Chief Henley was arrested that afternoon on federal charges of conspiracy to violate civil rights, obstruction of justice, and abuse of authority. Officer Bryce Henley was arrested simultaneously at his apartment on charges of deprivation of rights under color of law and hate crime violations. Deputy Chief Torres and Captain Webb were arrested on conspiracy charges related to their roles in suppressing investigations and intimidating witnesses. The local news coverage that evening showed Chief Henley being led out of the department building in handcuffs, a scene that would have been unimaginable just 3 months earlier when his son had stood on Highway 34 telling me that his daddy would cover for him. The federal charges carried maximum sentences of life in prison for the most serious violations, with mandatory minimum sentences that made plea bargaining difficult. That night, as I sat in my living room watching news coverage of the arrests with Simone and Zara, who'd driven home from college to be with us, I felt something I hadn't experienced since that day on the highway shoulder. Not satisfaction exactly, but a sense that the system could work when people were willing to demand that it work properly. "Dad," Zara said during a commercial break, "are you okay? This has to be overwhelming." I looked at my daughter, now 19 years old, more mature and thoughtful than I'd been at her age, shaped by experiences that included both the privilege of growing up in a stable family and the harsh lesson that racism could intrude on even the most carefully planned celebrations. "I'm okay," I said, and for the first time in months, I meant it. "I think we're all going to be okay." The federal investigation would continue for another 8 months. More officers would be arrested. The department would be placed under federal oversight with court-appointed monitors ensuring compliance with constitutional standards. Victims would receive financial settlements and official acknowledgments of the harm they'd suffered. But sitting there that night, watching the news coverage of arrests that had seemed impossible just weeks earlier, I realized that what mattered most wasn't the specific outcomes but the precedent being established. The message being sent that badge and family connections and political influence couldn't protect people who violated the constitutional rights of the citizens they'd sworn to serve. Officer Bryce Henley had thought his father would cover for him. He'd been wrong about that. But more importantly, he'd been wrong about something much more fundamental. He'd believed that power and privilege could silence the voices of people like me, people like Mrs. Banks, people like all the victims whose complaints had been dismissed over the years. The body camera footage from Highway 34 had proven him wrong about that too. The trial of Chief Robert Henley and his son, Officer Bryce Henley, began 11 months after that traffic stop on Highway 34 in a federal courthouse that had been transformed into a symbol of accountability that many in our community had never thought possible. I sat in the gallery on the first day of proceedings, watching as the man who had run our police department for 12 years was led to the defendant's table in shackles, his famous last name now associated with federal civil rights violation rather than local political influence. The prosecution's opening statement lasted 2 hours and painted a picture of systematic corruption that went far beyond what I had originally documented in my internal affairs files. Federal investigators had uncovered evidence of over 40 instances where complaints against officers with family or political connections had been improperly dismissed, where witnesses had been intimidated, where evidence had been destroyed or manipulated to protect favored personnel. Assistant Attorney General David Chen, no relation to my colleague Sarah, methodically walked the jury through a timeline that began long before my encounter with Bryce Henley. He showed how Chief Henley had created what prosecutors called a two-tier system of justice within the department, where certain officers operated under different rules and faced different consequences than their colleagues. The evidence will show, Chen told the jury, that Chief Henley didn't just fail to discipline his son for civil rights violations. He actively participated in a conspiracy to cover up those violations and to silence the victims who tried to seek justice through proper channels. When it came time for my testimony, I spent 3 days on the witness stand, first describing the traffic stop incident in detail that made several jurors visibly uncomfortable, then explaining how my investigation had uncovered the broader patterns of misconduct and cover-up. The defense attorneys tried to characterize me as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge against the department, but the body camera footage and the extensive documentation we'd compiled made their arguments seem desperate rather than convincing. The most powerful moment of the trial came when Mrs. Cordelia Banks took the stand. Now 74 years old and walking with a cane, she testified about her traffic stop encounter with Bryce Henley 8 months before mine, describing how he had humiliated her and made racist comments about her right to drive an expensive car in a nice neighborhood. Her voice shook as she explained how filing a complaint had made her feel like she was being investigated rather than heard. "I thought maybe I was being too sensitive," she told the jury. "I thought maybe that's just how young police officers talk these days. But when I saw the news about Mr. Dalton's case, when I heard that recording of what that officer said to him, I realized I wasn't being too sensitive. I was being treated like I didn't matter." The defense's case relied heavily on character witnesses, who testified about Chief Henley's long service to the community and his son's lack of prior disciplinary actions. But federal prosecutors systematically dismantled these testimonials by presenting evidence of how the chief had manipulated personnel records and intimidated potential witnesses to maintain the appearance of a clean department. The most damaging evidence came from the email communications between Chief Henley and his supervisors that had been recovered during the federal raids. Prosecutors read aloud messages where the chief had explicitly instructed subordinates to find reasons to dismiss certain complaints and to make problems go away, rather than conducting thorough investigations. In one particularly damning exchange, Chief Henley had written to Deputy Chief Torres about my original complaint. "The Dalton situation needs to be handled carefully. He's IA, so he knows procedure, but Bryce is young and made a mistake. Let's see if we can resolve this quietly without making it bigger than it needs to be," Torres had responded. "Already working on it. The complainant has no corroborating witnesses and Bryce's body camera malfunctioned. Should be easy to dismiss for lack of evidence." What they hadn't known was that federal investigators had already obtained my personal body camera footage through a federal subpoena, making their plan to dismiss the complaint for lack of evidence an obvious attempt to obstruct justice. The jury deliberated for 6 days. During that time, I continued working in the Internal Affairs Office, now under federal oversight with new supervisors who had been brought in from other jurisdictions to ensure independence. The department was operating under a consent decree that required federal approval for all disciplinary decisions and mandated extensive retraining for all personnel. When the verdict came back, I was sitting in my office reviewing case files when Sarah knocked on my door with tears in her eyes. "Guilty," she said. "Guilty on all counts for both of them." Chief Robert Henley was convicted of conspiracy to violate civil rights, obstruction of justice, and abuse of authority under color of law. Officer Bryce Henley was convicted of deprivation of rights under color of law, conspiracy, and federal hate crime violations. The sentences, handed down 2 weeks later, reflected the seriousness of their crimes. Chief Henley received 12 years in federal prison, while his son received 8 years. The other defendants who had been arrested during the federal raids received sentences ranging from 3 to 6 years, with several agreeing to cooperation deals in exchange for reduced penalties. Deputy Chief Torres, who had been instrumental in the cover-up efforts, received 5 years and was required to testify in civil cases brought by victims seeking damages from the department. 6 months after the convictions, I was offered the position of Chief of Internal Affairs for the reformed police department, working under a new chief who had been hired from outside the state specifically to implement the federal oversight requirements. It was an opportunity to help rebuild the department from the ground up, to create systems that would prevent the kind of corruption we'd exposed, but I decided to decline the offer. The federal investigation and trial had taken almost 2 years of my life, 2 years of reliving trauma and fighting battles that had sometimes felt impossible to win. I was tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion and everything to do with the emotional cost of challenging a system that had seemed unshakable. Instead, I accepted a position with the FBI's Civil Rights Division, working with Agent Morrison's team to investigate similar patterns of misconduct in other jurisdictions. It was work that felt meaningful, work that would let me use what I'd learned to help other victims who might not have the resources or knowledge to fight back on their own. 3 years after Officer Bryce Henley had called me a racial slur on Highway 34, I stood in a high school auditorium watching my daughter receive her bachelor's degree, summa cum laude, from the state university. This time, I was there 45 minutes early, sitting in the front row with Simone, holding white roses with baby's breath that we'd bought specifically for this moment. When Zara walked across the stage to receive her diploma, she looked directly at me and smiled. The same smile she'd had as a little girl when I'd taught her to ride a bicycle or helped her with difficult homework problems. But there was something different in her expression now, something that spoke to the pride she felt not just in her own accomplishment, but in what our family had survived and overcome together. After the ceremony, as we stood outside the auditorium taking pictures, Zara hugged me tightly and whispered in my ear, "Thank you for showing me that doing the right thing matters more than taking the easy path." That night, as we celebrated at the same restaurant where we'd had that difficult dinner after her high school graduation, I thought about all the ways our lives had changed since that day on Highway 34. The federal investigation had brought justice, but it had also brought something more important, the knowledge that systems could change when people were willing to demand change. I still carried the body camera that had recorded Officer Henley's words and actions. I still worked cases involving police misconduct and civil rights violations. But I no longer carried the anger and helplessness that had consumed me in the weeks after that traffic stop. Instead, I carried the understanding that individual experiences of injustice could become catalysts for broader change when people were willing to fight for accountability. The last text message I'd received from Mrs. Banks had come 2 weeks earlier, after she'd learned about my new position with the FBI. "Thank you for not giving up," she'd written. "Thank you for showing an old woman that her voice still mattered." That message, more than any federal conviction or civil settlement, reminded me why the fight had been worth it. Not just for me, not just for my family, but for everyone who had been told their complaints didn't matter, their voices wouldn't be heard, their experiences weren't important enough to demand justice. Officer Bryce Henley had been wrong about his father covering for him. But more importantly, he'd been wrong about the power of people to demand accountability from those who served them. The body camera footage from Highway 34 had captured more than just evidence of civil rights violation. It had captured proof that even the most protected perpetrators could be held responsible when victims refused to accept that their suffering was the price of someone else's power. Sometimes the worst moments of our lives become the catalyst for the most important work we'll ever do. Sometimes being left with no choice but to fight back is exactly the choice we needed to make all along. If you've experienced injustice at the hands of those who were supposed to protect you, know that your voice matters. Your experience is valid, and there are people working to ensure that power can never again be used to silence the truth. The system isn't perfect, but it can be changed when enough people demand that it work the way it was designed to work. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that every act of courage, no matter how small it might seem, contributes to a larger movement toward justice and accountability that benefits all of us.